Please, don't let them take me again. Sarah's voice cracked against the desert wind as she stumbled toward the lone figure on horseback. Blood stained her torn dress. Dust covered her face like war paint. I can't run anymore. The stranger dismounted slowly. His eyes swept the horizon where smoke still rose from the stagecoach wreckage. 3 riders circled in the distance like vultures waiting for death. Ma'am, you're safe now. His voice was steady, weathered like his hands. Name's Jake Morrison. She flinched when he reached for his canteen. Don't touch me. Easy now. Jake held up his palms. Just water, nothing more. But something in her eyes told him this wasn't about water. This was about trust broken so completely that even kindness felt like a trap. The Copper Ridge stagecoach attack had left 6 dead. Sarah Martinez was the only survivor, and she knew why. The McKinnon gang hadn't come for gold or silver. They'd come for her. They'll be back, she whispered, scanning the empty desert. They always come back. Jake studied her face. Beneath the fear lived something else. Determination. Fire that refused to die. Not if I have anything to say about it. The sun hung merciless overhead, casting shadows sharp enough to cut skin. In the distance, Red Mesa rose like a fortress against the endless blue sky. Sarah had been traveling to her sister's wedding when the attack happened. Now her sister would bury an empty coffin. Why did you help me? Sarah's voice was barely audible above the wind. Jake tightened his horse's reins. Because some things are worth doing right. But there was more to it than that. Something in her desperation reminded him of another woman, another time, another failure he couldn't undo. The nearest town is Crossroads, Jake said. 2 hours' ride. Sarah shook her head violently. No towns. They have people there. People who can protect you. People who ask questions. Jake caught something in her tone. Fear, yes, but also shame. What was Sarah Martinez running from besides the McKinnon gang? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and death from the wreckage behind them. Jake's horse stamped nervously. Time was running short. Ma'am, those riders won't give up. We need shelter. Sarah looked toward the mesa. There's an old mining camp. Abandoned. My father used to work there. Jake hesitated. Abandoned places made for easy traps. But the fear in her eyes was real, and he'd learned to trust fear over hope. How far? Half-day's ride, maybe less if we push hard. Jake mounted his horse and extended his hand. Sarah stared at it like it might burn her. I've been running for 3 days, she whispered. I don't know how much further I can go. Then we better get started. Sarah finally took his hand. The moment their skin touched, something electric passed between them, not romantic. Something deeper. Recognition. 2 people who'd been running for too long. As they rode toward the mesa, Sarah allowed herself one backward glance. The vultures had found the stagecoach. Nature was already reclaiming what man had destroyed. But the McKinnon gang was still out there, and they wouldn't stop. Not until they found what they were looking for. The abandoned mining camp appeared at dusk, like a ghost town carved from red stone. Sarah slid from the horse, legs trembling. There's a cabin up the hill. My father used to stay there. They climbed to a small cabin perched on the mesa's edge. Inside, dust motes danced in the dying sunlight through broken windows. It's not much, Sarah said. It's shelter. Jake examined the doorframe. And it's defensible. Sarah watched him work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't a man who'd learned caution from books. You're not just a drifter, are you? Jake's hand stilled. What makes you say that? The way you check corners. Keep your gun hand free. Sarah sat heavily in a dusty chair. My father taught me to read men like ore veins. Jake finished barricading the door. Your father was smart. Was he? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Smart men don't die in accidents when the mine's been closed for months. Jake understood why she'd chosen this place. It wasn't just shelter from the McKinnon gang, it was shelter from the truth. Sarah, Jake said quietly. What really happened on that stagecoach? Her eyes flashed in the dying light. I told you, the McKinnon gang attacked us. That's not what I'm asking. Sarah stood abruptly, walking to the broken window. The desert stretched endlessly below. They didn't attack the stagecoach, Jake. They attacked me. The others died because I was there. Why? Because 3 weeks ago, I witnessed something I shouldn't have. Something that could hang half the men in Phoenix. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. What did you see? Before Sarah could answer, Jake heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls below. They found us, Sarah whispered. Jake moved to the window. In the gathering darkness he counted 4 riders approaching fast, too fast for men who weren't sure where they were going. Someone had told them exactly where to look. Sarah, Jake said, his voice deadly calm. That mining accident your father died in, when exactly did it happen? Her face went white as fresh snow. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The same time Sarah witnessed something that could hang half of Phoenix. There were no coincidences in the desert. And Jake Morrison was starting to understand that protecting Sarah Martinez might cost him everything. 3 weeks. The same timeline that haunted Jake Morrison for 5 years. Sarah, Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension. We need to move now. But Sarah remained frozen at the window, watching the riders approach. You didn't answer my question, she said. You're not just a drifter. Jake checked his gun. 6 bullets, 4 riders. The math wasn't encouraging. No, he said quietly. I'm not. Then what are you? Jake hesitated. For 5 years he'd kept his past buried, but something about this woman made him want to tell the truth. I used to rob banks. Sarah turned from the window, eyes wide. Used to? 5 years ago I was part of a gang, the Dalton brothers. We hit banks from Colorado to California. Jake's voice was steady but his hands trembled. We thought we were untouchable. What changed? Jake closed his eyes, back in that dusty street in Tombstone. Gunfire, screams, blood and gunpowder mixing with desert sand. We hit the wrong bank. A family was inside, a woman and her little girl. His voice cracked. The girl couldn't have been more than 6. Sarah's breath caught. What happened? My partner Billy Dalton was young, nervous. When the woman screamed, Jake couldn't finish. He killed them? He killed the little girl. Accident, he said. But that child was dead because of my choices. Outside, the hoofbeats were getting closer. The woman survived. Barely, but she identified all of us. Every man in the gang was wanted for murder. Sarah studied his face. But you're here, free. Judge Harrison in Phoenix took a chance on me. Said if I testified against the others he'd give me 3 years instead of hanging. And you did it? Jake nodded. I testified. Every single member went to prison. And Judge Harrison set you free. After 3 years, said I'd paid my debt. Clean slate. Sarah was quiet, processing this. Outside, the riders had stopped. The Judge Harrison I saw take money from the Valdez brothers, Sarah said slowly. He's the same man who gave you a second chance. Yes. And now you're protecting the woman who could destroy him. Jake met her eyes. Sometimes doing right means betraying the people who helped you. A gunshot cracked through the night. Jake extinguished the candle, plunging them into darkness. They're not just hunting you anymore, he whispered. They're hunting us both. Because you chose to help me. Because I chose to do what I should have done 5 years ago. More gunshots. Jake could hear boots on the rocky path. There's a back window, Sarah whispered. We can climb down to the mine shaft. How well do you know those tunnels? Well enough. My father mapped every inch before he died. Before he was killed, Jake corrected silently. He was starting to understand that Sarah's father hadn't died in any accident. When you saw Judge Harrison take that money, where exactly were you? The courthouse. After hours, I was picking up my father's effects from his safety deposit box. And the judge didn't see you? I hid behind a pillar when I heard voices. Jake helped her through the back window, then followed down toward the mine shaft. Above them he could hear the cabin door being kicked in. They're inside, Sarah breathed. Move, Jake whispered. Stay close and quiet. They descended into the mine shaft, darkness swallowing them. Behind them, lantern light flickered as their pursuers searched. Jake, Sarah whispered as they felt along the tunnel wall. That little girl who died, what was her name? Jake was quiet for so long Sarah thought he hadn't heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Emma. Her name was Emma. Is that why you helped me? Because of her? Jake considered the question as they moved deeper into the mine. Was it guilt that made him stop for Sarah, or something else? Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe I got tired of running from who I used to be. Footsteps echoed behind them. Their pursuers had found the back window. How far to the other side? Jake asked. Quarter mile. But Jake, there's something else about these tunnels. What? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. This is where they killed my father. Jake stopped walking. Even in darkness he felt the weight of her words. You know for certain it wasn't an accident? I found his body. Right here. His neck was broken but not from a cave-in. From a rope. The footsteps behind them were getting closer. Jake could hear voices echoing through the shaft. They hanged him and made it look like a mining accident. Sarah continued. But I knew, a daughter knows. Why didn't you go to the sheriff? Sarah's bitter laugh echoed off the walls. Sheriff Davidson? He's been in Judge Harrison's pocket for years. Jake understood now why Sarah had been so afraid of towns. In a world where lawmen couldn't be trusted, a woman alone had nowhere to turn. That's why you were at the courthouse, Jake said, looking for evidence. My father kept detailed records. I thought if I could find his notes, you could expose them all. Instead, I walked into Judge Harrison taking money from the Valdez brothers. The voices behind them were clearer now. They were arguing about which direction to take. We need to move faster, Jake whispered. They quickened their pace, Sarah leading through passages she'd memorized as a child. The tunnel sloped upward, and Jake could feel a breeze carrying desert air. Almost there, Sarah breathed. But just as they reached the tunnel's end, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. One of the voices behind them, calling out orders. He knew that voice. Billy Dalton, his former partner. The man who'd killed little Emma. The man who should have been rotting in prison. Jake's grip tightened on his gun as the pieces fell into place. Judge Harrison hadn't just been selling pardons to the Valdez brothers. He'd been selling them to anyone with enough money, including the members of Jake's old gang. The night had settled over the valley, quiet except for the low chorus of crickets. Sarah sat near the fading fire, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She traced the worn edge of her mother's ring, the metal warm from her touch. Memories came unbidden. Her father's voice at the dinner table, the smell of bread rising in the small kitchen, the laughter that once filled a house now claimed by silence. Across from her, Jake was sharpening his knife, each scrape echoing like a heartbeat. He noticed her distant gaze. You stir thinking of home, he said softly. Sarah nodded. Sometimes I wonder if I still ever feel safe enough to laugh like that again. Jake paused, then set the knife aside. Maybe laughter isn't set lost, he replied. Maybe it just waits, like the dawn, hidden but certain. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dark. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed a faint smile. Dawn broke over the desert like a wound bleeding orange across the sky. Jake and Sarah emerged from the mine tunnel on the far side of Red Mesa, their clothes torn and dusty, their faces etched with exhaustion. We can't keep running, Sarah said, collapsing against a boulder. They'll track us forever. Jake scanned the horizon. In the distance, the town of Crossroads shimmered in the morning heat like a mirage. 2 days ago, he would have avoided that place at all costs. Now it might be their only chance. We go to town, he said. Sarah's eyes widened. Are you insane? You just told me half the lawmen in these parts are corrupt. Not all of them. And there's something Billy Dalton and his boys won't expect. What's that? Jake's smile was grim. Me walking into a town full of people who might recognize my face. They made their way down the rocky slope toward the settlement below. Crossroads wasn't much to look at. A main street lined with weathered buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a sheriff's office that looked like it had seen better days. But it was civilization, and right now that meant witnesses. Jake, Sarah said as they approached the outskirts of town. What if someone here knows who you are? What if they remember the wanted posters? Then we find out real quick who we can trust. The first person they encountered was an elderly man sweeping the front steps of the general store. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face creasing with concern. You folks look like you've had a rough night, he said. Rougher than most, Jake replied. Name's Jake Morrison. This is Sarah Martinez. We need to see the sheriff. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something familiar about that name, Jake Morrison, something that tickled the back of his memory like an itch he couldn't scratch. Sheriff Lawson's in his office. But mister, you sure you want to go stirring up that particular hornet's nest? Why do you ask? Because Sheriff Lawson ain't like the others around these parts. He's what you might call honest. And honest men tend to ask uncomfortable questions. Jake met Sarah's eyes. An honest sheriff. That was either the best news they'd heard in days or the worst. Thank you, Jake said to the old man. We'll take our chances. They walked down the dusty main street, drawing stares from the early morning shopkeepers and ranchers. Sarah pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, acutely aware of how they must look. The sheriff's office sat at the end of the street like a fortress of law in a lawless land. Through the window they could see a tall man in a worn leather vest sitting behind a desk, writing in a ledger. Jake pushed open the door, and the man looked up. Sheriff Tom Lawson was perhaps 50 years old, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence for one lifetime. But there was something else in those eyes. Integrity. "Help you folks?" Lawson asked, setting down his pen. "Sheriff, my name is Jake Morrison. This woman is Sarah Martinez. We need protection." Lawson leaned back in his chair, studying them both carefully. "Protection from what?" "From men who killed her father and are trying to kill us both." "That's a serious accusation. You got any proof?" Sarah stepped forward. 3 weeks ago my father was murdered in the old silver mine outside town. It was made to look like an accident, but I found evidence that he was hanged." Lawson's expression didn't change, but Jake caught something flickering in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Your father was Thomas Martinez." Sarah nodded. "You knew him?" "I knew him. Good man. Came to me a few times with concerns about corruption in Phoenix, said he had evidence that certain officials were taking bribes." Jake felt Sarah tense beside him. This was it, the moment of truth. "Sheriff," Jake said carefully, "there's something you need to know about me." "I'm listening." Jake took a deep breath. 5 years ago I was convicted of bank robbery. I served 3 years in prison and was pardoned by Judge Harrison in Phoenix. Lawson's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his gun. "You're that Jake Morrison. I remember the wanted posters." "Yes, sir. But I served my time. I testified against my former associates, and Judge Harrison gave me a clean slate. And now? Now I believe Judge Harrison has been selling pardons to criminals who should be in prison, including members of my old gang." Sarah watched the exchange between the two men, her heart pounding. Everything depended on whether this sheriff was truly as honest as the old man claimed. "That's a hell of an accusation," Lawson said finally. "It's a hell of a situation," Jake replied. Lawson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. For a long moment the only sound in the office was the ticking of a clock on the wall. "Miss Martinez," he said without turning around, "tell me exactly what you saw in Phoenix." Sarah told him everything. The courthouse, the money changing hands, the conversation she'd overheard about the Valdez brothers. The sheriff listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "And you believe these same people killed your father?" "I know they did." Lawson turned back to them. "There's been talk, rumors about Judge Harrison, about certain prisoners being released early for no apparent reason, about evidence disappearing from court cases." "You've been investigating him?" Jake asked. "I've been asking questions, quietly. But I'm just a small-town sheriff. I don't have the authority to take on a federal judge." "What if you had witnesses?" Sarah asked. "What if you had someone willing to testify?" Lawson looked at her, then at Jake. "It would be dangerous, for all of us. More dangerous than letting corruption spread like poison through the territory?" Before Lawson could answer, the office door burst open. A young deputy rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sheriff, there's riders coming into town. 4 of them. They're asking about a man and a woman." Jake's blood turned to ice. "Billy Dalton. You know them?" Lawson asked. "I know their leader. He's supposed to be in prison." Lawson grabbed his rifle from the rack behind his desk. Not anymore, apparently. Through the window they could see 4 men on horseback riding slowly down the main street. The leader was a thin man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth. Even from a distance, Jake could see the familiar swagger, the arrogant way Billy Dalton sat his horse like he owned the world. "There's a back door," Lawson said. "You folks can slip out while I handle this." Jake shook his head. "No more running. If Billy Dalton wants to find me, let him find me. But it's going to be on my terms." "Jake, no," Sarah whispered. "He'll kill you." "Maybe. But if I keep running, he'll kill both of us eventually. and probably anyone else who gets in his way. Jake checked his gun. 6 bullets. Same as always. But this time, the math might work out differently. "Sheriff," he said, "I'm going to ask you to trust me. Trust that the man I am now isn't the man I was 5 years ago." Lawson studied his face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "What do you need?" "Just witness whatever happens next. And if I don't make it, make sure Sarah gets to testify against Judge Harrison." The riders had stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Billy Dalton dismounted and walked toward the door with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. Jake Morrison stepped outside to meet his past one final time. The night had settled heavy over the valley, pressing silence into every corner of the land. Only the faint chorus of crickets and the distant cry of a lone coyote broke the stillness. The cabin walls groaned softly against the wind, as if remembering storms long past. Sarah sat near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes tracing the shadows that flickered across the wooden floor. The firelight painted her face with restless gold, revealing the tired hollows of her cheeks, the stubborn strength in her jaw. She thought of the road behind her, of dust, hunger, and the cruel stares of townsfolk who turned their eyes away when she begged for work. Those memories clung like smoke, refusing to leave. John sat opposite, mending a strap on his worn saddle. His hands, rough with years of labor, moved with quiet patience. He did not look up, but he felt her watching. For days now he had carried the weight of unspoken words. He knew what the townspeople whispered about him, the solitary rancher who bartered for company, who could not keep a family of his own. And yet here in the hush of the cabin, with the storm pacing at the windows, he sensed something changing. The distance between them had narrowed, not with words but with silence that felt shared instead of empty. Sarah's thoughts wandered to her mother's ring, the thin band that still clung to her finger. She turned it slowly, feeling the groove where it had worn her skin. "It never fit right," she whispered, more to herself than to him. John finally raised his eyes, the firelight catching the deep brown in them. "It fits you now," he said simply, and then looked back to his work. The words lingered in the air, heavier than she expected. For a moment she almost answered. Instead she turned her gaze to the window, where the storm clouds smothered the stars. Beyond the cabin the world was restless. Wolves padded through the dark timber, their low howls carried on the wind. The creek, swollen from days of rain, gurgled angrily against its banks. Somewhere far across the prairie, a rider passed, his lantern bobbing faintly before vanishing into the black. Sarah imagined lives unfolding in every shadow, men chasing debts, women clinging to fragile promises, children dreaming of bread instead of hunger. The frontier was merciless, but it bound them all in the same net of survival. John spoke again, softer this time. "You don't owe me anything you don't wish to give." His voice carried neither demand nor pity, only the quiet honesty of a man who had lost too much to gamble with pride. Sarah turned, meeting his eyes fully. She saw the loneliness there, but also the steadiness of someone who could stand against the cruelest wind. Her chest ached with something she had no name for. She wanted to trust it, yet fear whispered that hope was only another trick the world played on the desperate. The fire snapped, throwing sparks against the chimney. Sarah rose, walked to the small window and pressed her palm to the cold glass. Outside, the prairie stretched into endless dark. Somewhere beyond, her past lay buried with debts and sorrow. Somewhere ahead, a different life waited, fragile but alive. She did not turn when she spoke. "Tomorrow may not bring better days, but at least we won't be facing them alone." Her voice trembled, but it carried truth. John set aside the saddle strap. He stood, slow and deliberate, and stepped closer. Not too close, just enough for her to feel the warmth of another presence beside her. They stood in silence, the storm outside echoing the storm within. And for the first time in many months, Sarah felt the weight in her chest lift, if only a little. Hope, thin as dawn's first light, had begun to stir. Jake Morrison stepped outside to meet his past one final time. Billy Dalton stood 20 feet away, his pale eyes scanning Jake like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "Well, well," Billy drawled. "Jake Morrison, thought you'd learn to keep your nose out of other people's business." "Billy," Jake's hand rested near his gun, "you're supposed to be in prison." Billy's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Judge Harrison's got a forgiving nature, for the right price." Sheriff Lawson emerged from his office, rifle in hand. "Take it outside my town." "This ain't about your town, Sheriff," Billy said. This is about a woman who saw something she shouldn't have. Billy's three companions spread out across the street. Sarah recognized two of them from the stagecoach attack. "I'm not running anymore," Sarah called from the doorway. Billy's attention snapped to her. There she is, the little witness who's been causing so much trouble. "You killed my father." Sarah stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. "Your father was poking around where he didn't belong. Just like you." Jake moved between Billy and Sarah. "This ends here, Billy. No more innocent people get hurt." "Innocent?" Billy's eyes glittered with malice. "You betrayed us, Jake, testified against your own brothers." "I testified against murderers," Jake replied, "including the man who shot a 6-year-old girl." Billy's face darkened. "That was an accident." "Was it an accident when you hanged Thomas Martinez in that mine shaft?" Billy shrugged. "Sometimes a man's got to make hard choices." The street had cleared. Shopkeepers pulled their children inside. Windows slammed shut. 4 against 2 ain't fair odds, Sheriff Lawson observed. 4 against 1, Billy corrected. "Jake ain't gonna fight us, because if you do, we'll make sure the lady here suffers before she dies." Jake's jaw tightened. This was the trap he'd feared. "Jake," Sarah said softly, "don't let him use me against you." "Smart woman," Billy said. "Too bad she's got to die anyway." That's when Jake Morrison made his choice. "Sarah," he said without turning around, "when the shooting starts, get inside." Jake's gun cleared leather faster than anyone expected. His first shot took down the man to Billy's left. His second shot shattered the hitching post inches from Billy's head. Billy dove for cover as his remaining men opened fire. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. Sheriff Lawson dragged Sarah inside as lead flew overhead. Jake rolled behind a barrel, reloading. 4 bullets left, 3 men still standing. "You always were the fastest draw," Billy called out. "But you're outnumbered, Jake." Jake waited until one of Billy's men stepped into the open, then put a bullet through his shoulder. The outlaw spun and fell. 2 down, 2 to go. Then he heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats from the edge of town. "That'll be the rest of my boys," Billy called out triumphantly. Sarah peered through the office window, her heart sinking as she counted 6 new riders. But then she noticed something. "Sheriff," she whispered urgently, "those aren't outlaws. Look at their badges." The approaching riders wore federal marshal badges. "This is Deputy Marshal John Carter," one of them shouted. "By order of the territorial court, you're all under arrest." Billy's face went white. "That's impossible," Judge Harrison said. "Judge Harrison is in federal custody," Carter announced, "charged with corruption and bribery. Your pardons are void." The remaining outlaw threw down his gun. Billy looked around desperately, realizing he was trapped. "It's over, Billy," Jake said. But Billy wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he lunged for Sarah, grabbing her around the throat. "If I'm going down, she's coming with me," he screamed. Jake's blood turned to ice. But this time was different. This time Jake Morrison knew exactly what kind of man he wanted to be. His gun spoke once more. Billy Dalton crumpled to the ground. Sarah stumbled backward, gasping as Jake caught her in his arms. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Deputy Marshal Carter approached them. "Jake Morrison, your testimony helped us build our case against Judge Harrison. What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we make sure justice is done," Carter replied. "Your father's murder case will be reopened." Sarah looked at her father's killer, now bleeding in the dust. Justice, after so many weeks of running and fear. As the marshals led away the surviving outlaws, Jake and Sarah stood together in the settling dust. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Jake looked into her eyes and saw something he'd never dared hope for. A future. "Now," he said, "we start over." 3 months after the dust settled in Crossroads, Sarah Martinez stood at the window of the small house she'd rented on the edge of town. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in years she felt something she'd almost forgotten: peace. "Coffee's ready," Jake called from the kitchen. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, 2 steaming cups in his weathered hands. These quiet moments had become precious to her. No gunfire, no running, just the simple pleasure of sharing breakfast with a man who'd proven his worth when it mattered most. "The trial starts next week," Sarah said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Jake nodded. "You ready to testify?" I've been ready since the day they killed my father. The surviving members of Billy Dalton's gang would finally face justice for Thomas Martinez's murder, along with the stagecoach attack and countless other crimes. Judge Harrison's corruption trial had already resulted in a 20-year sentence, and several other officials had been arrested in the widening investigation. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "what happens after the trial? Where do we go from here?" It was the question that had been hanging between them for weeks. The immediate danger was over, but the future remained unwritten. Jake set down his coffee and moved to stand beside her at the window. "I've been thinking about that. And there's a ranch for sale about 20 miles north of here. Good water, decent grazing land. Owner's getting too old to work it himself." Sarah felt her heart skip. "You're thinking of buying it?" "I'm thinking of making an offer. If you'd be interested in helping me run it." She studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened with uncertainty. This strong man who'd faced down killers without flinching was nervous about asking for her partnership. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "are you asking me to move in with you?" He turned to meet her gaze and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "I'm asking for a lot more than that, Sarah." Her breath caught. "What exactly are you asking?" Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Sarah gasped. A simple gold ring, not fancy or expensive, but beautiful in its honest simplicity. "I'm asking you to marry me," Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I know I'm not much of a catch, ex-outlaw with more regrets than money, but I love you, Sarah Martinez, and I'd like to spend whatever years I have left proving I'm worthy of your trust." Sarah felt tears blur her vision. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and joy. After so much darkness, so much fear and running, here was a man offering her something she'd never dared dream of. A home, a future, love. "Jake," she whispered, "you already proved you're worthy, the day you chose to protect me instead of saving yourself." "Is that a yes?" Sarah laughed, the sound bright and clear as a bell. "That's a yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "When?" she asked. "Soon as you're ready. Sheriff Lawson can perform the ceremony, or we can wait for the circuit preacher." "I don't need a big wedding," Sarah said. "I just need you." Jake pulled her into his arms, and Sarah marveled at how safe she felt there. This man who'd once robbed banks and run with outlaws had become her sanctuary, her protector, her future. "There's something else," Jake said against her hair. "What?" "The territorial governor offered me a job. Deputy marshal, says they need men who understand how outlaws think." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Do you want it?" "Part of me does. Chance to do some good, make up for past mistakes." Jake paused. "But only if you're comfortable with it. Only if you think you could love a lawman as much as you love an ex-outlaw." Sarah smiled, thinking of how far they'd both come. "I could love you no matter what badge you wear, or don't wear. Then I'll take the job. At least for a while. See if I'm any good at being one of the good guys." They stood together at the window, watching the sun climb higher over the desert. Somewhere out there, other people were struggling with their own demons, their own choices between right and wrong. But here, in this small house on the edge of crossroads, two wounded souls had found healing in each other. "Jake," Sarah said suddenly, "do you ever regret it? Testifying against your old gang? Starting over?" Jake considered the question. "I regret a lot of things, Sarah. I regret that little girl in Tombstone. I regret the years I spent running from the man I should have been. But meeting you? Choosing to protect you?" He shook his head. "That's the one thing I'll never regret. Even though it nearly got you killed? Especially because of that. Sometimes a man's got to risk everything to find out what he's really made of." 2 weeks later, on a clear autumn morning, Sarah Martinez became Sarah Morrison in a simple ceremony behind the sheriff's office. The whole town turned out for the celebration, including Deputy Marshal Carter, who'd ridden down from Phoenix specifically for the occasion. "You clean up nice for an ex-outlaw," Sheriff Lawson joked as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Just wait until you see how I look in a marshal's badge," Jake replied, grinning. As the sun set over their new ranch that evening, Jake and Sarah sat on the porch of their modest home, watching the horizon paint itself in shades of orange and purple. The house needed work. The fences needed mending, and there would be long days of hard labor ahead. But they would face it together. No regrets? Jake asked, echoing their earlier conversation. Sarah took his hand, feeling the solid weight of her wedding ring. No regrets. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound lonely but somehow hopeful. The desert could be a harsh place, unforgiving of weakness and mistakes, but it could also be a place of second chances, where two people could build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison and his bride began their new life together, leaving their troubled histories behind them like shadows that fade with the coming dawn. Love had found them in the most unlikely of places, and it had transformed them both. In a world where justice was often scarce and second chances even scarcer, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies. Sometimes it was learning to trust your heart.